Something's moving. Something is moving. Freak.
In 1947, Thomas was brutally captured and forced to live with Bigfoot for over 40 years before the FBI found out and had to make a horrifying decision. The effects of being Bigfoot's roommate were truly mortifying. And what state they found Thomas in is even worse. This is the terrifying story of how Thomas Garrett lived with Bigfoot. The creatures had been waiting for Thomas when he first ventured into the Cascade Mountains in 1947, as if they'd chosen him specifically for reasons he would never fully understand. From his first night in the wilderness, massive shapes had surrounded his camp, beings that stood nearly 9 feet tall and moved with an intelligence that was unmistakably predatory. They hadn't attacked him, but they'd made their intentions clear through gestures and vocalizations that carried an unmistakable message. He belonged to them now. The creatures had herded him deeper into the wilderness, away from any hope of rescue, to a place where human rules no longer applied, and their ancient laws governed every aspect of existence. The beings Thomas came to know as his captors operated according to a social structure that was both primitive and sophisticated, with hierarchies based on size, age, and something he could only describe as psychic dominance. The largest among them, a massive patriarch that Thomas privately called the Elder, seemed to possess an intelligence that rivaled human cognition while remaining utterly alien in its motivations. This creature had claimed Thomas as a prize, a living specimen to be studied, used, and ultimately broken through decades of psychological manipulation that would leave scars deeper than any physical wound. Thomas's daily existence became a carefully orchestrated routine of servitude and observation, with the creatures using him as both a tool and an experiment in human endurance. They forced him to build structures using techniques they demonstrated through intimidation and violence, construction methods that required him to work alongside beings whose strength could crush him without effort. The cabin that would later puzzle investigators had been built under constant supervision, with Thomas serving as the architect while his captors provided the impossible physical labor that no human could have accomplished alone. When he attempted to resist their demands, they would withhold food for days, leaving him weak and compliant. The creature's interest in Thomas went beyond simple curiosity about human behavior. They seemed to be conducting a long-term study of human adaptation under extreme psychological pressure. They would disappear for days at a time, leaving him alone with the illusion of freedom, only to return when he began to hope for escape. These psychological games became more sophisticated over the years, with the beings learning to manipulate his emotions and responses with a precision that suggested they understood human psychology better than most humans did themselves. They would allow him brief glimpses of the outside world, forcing him to make supervised trips to town for supplies, always with the unspoken threat that any attempt to seek help would result in consequences too terrible to imagine. The first reports of unusual activity around Thomas's property began surfacing in the early 1950s, when loggers working nearby claims started describing encounters that made them question their sobriety. They spoke of massive shapes moving through the trees at dawn, sounds that resembled human conversation, but in voices too deep and resonant to belong to any person. Equipment would be moved overnight, arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than random animal interference. Most disturbing were the gifts, carved wooden objects and arrangements of stones that appeared near their camps, crafted with a skill that implied hands far larger than human, but possessing an artistic sensibility that seemed designed to mock human attempts at creativity. The creature's communication with Thomas evolved from simple gestures to a complex system of sounds and symbols that he was forced to learn under threat of starvation or violence. They seemed fascinated by human language, often forcing him to repeat words and phrases while they attempted to mimic the sounds with vocal cords that weren't designed for human speech. These sessions would last for hours, with Thomas serving as an unwilling teacher in a classroom where failure to cooperate resulted in punishment that left him broken and terrified. Food became a weapon of control, with the creatures providing sustenance that kept Thomas alive, but dependent on their generosity. They would bring him fruits, vegetables, and nuts, gathered from locations he could never find on his own, always in quantities that reminded him of his helplessness. When he attempted to hunt or forage independently, they would sabotage his efforts, destroying his traps and scaring away game until he learned that survival depended entirely on their whims. His supervised shopping trips to town reflected this forced diet. Massive amounts of raw vegetables, fruits, and nuts, but very little meat or processed food, creating a shopping pattern that puzzled store owners. The transformation in Thomas's appearance over the years became a source of whispered speculation among the few locals who encountered him during his rare, supervised visits to town. By the 1960s, something had changed in fundamental ways that went beyond simple aging. His posture had become more upright and confident, his movements more fluid and purposeful, but there was something broken in his eyes that suggested a man who had learned to survive by surrendering his humanity piece by piece. His hands had grown larger and more powerful from the constant manual labor the creatures demanded, while his vocal patterns had changed to incorporate sounds that seemed designed to communicate with his captors. As the years passed, Thomas began to understand that he wasn't the first human the creatures had captured. Evidence throughout their territory suggested a long history of contact with people who had ventured too deep into the wilderness and never returned. Personal belongings from missing hikers and campers were displayed like trophies in hidden caves, arranged with a care that suggested the creatures valued these remnants of their previous captives. The implications were horrifying. Thomas was part of a pattern that stretched back generations, a tradition of human collection that the creatures had refined over decades of practice. The creatures' treatment of Thomas became more sophisticated as they learned to exploit his psychological vulnerabilities with surgical precision. They would withhold social contact for weeks at a time, leaving him in complete isolation until he began to crave even their alien presence. When they finally returned, Thomas would find himself grateful for their attention, a response that horrified him even as he found himself unable to resist the conditioning they had imposed through decades of careful manipulation. Physical changes in Thomas became more pronounced as the years of captivity took their toll on his body and mind. His hands grew larger and more powerful from the constant manual labor the creatures demanded, while his posture adapted to walking alongside beings whose stride length was nearly twice his own. Most disturbing was the way his vocal patterns began to incorporate sounds and frequencies that seemed designed to communicate with his captors, as if his very humanity was being slowly eroded by prolonged exposure to their alien influence. The creatures' interest in human reproduction became apparent when they began bringing Thomas into contact with other captives, women who had been taken from hiking trails and camping sites across the Pacific Northwest. These encounters were brief and traumatic, with Thomas realizing that the creatures were attempting to breed humans like livestock, studying the results of their experiments with a clinical detachment that revealed the true depth of their alien nature. The fate of these women and any children that might have resulted from these forced encounters remained a mystery that would haunt Thomas for the rest of his life. Government interest in the creature's territory began in the late 1970s when satellite imagery revealed anomalies that couldn't be explained by conventional analysis. The forest around Thomas's prison showed patterns of growth and development that suggested systematic cultivation, with clearings arranged in geometric shapes that appeared too regular to be natural. Thermal imaging detected heat signatures that indicated a population far larger than one hermit could account for, with movement patterns that suggested a community living according to organized social structures. The creatures seemed aware of this increased government attention, becoming more cautious in their movements and more aggressive in their control of Thomas. They began forcing him to help them develop countermeasures against human technology, using his knowledge of electronics and communication systems to create interference patterns that would confuse government monitoring equipment. Thomas found himself trapped between his desire to escape and his terror of what the creatures would do to him if they discovered any attempt at betrayal. Intelligence agencies had been quietly monitoring the region since the early days of the Cold War, initially suspecting that Thomas might be involved in espionage or illegal weapons development. Surveillance teams reported encounters that challenged their training and experience, describing beings of enormous size that moved through the forest with intelligence and purpose that defied classification as wildlife. These creatures seemed aware of the surveillance efforts and would occasionally leave messages for the watchers, arrangements of stones and branches that conveyed meaning through symbolism that no government analyst could decode. The decision to investigate Thomas's property came after decades of accumulating evidence that something unprecedented was occurring in those remote mountains. Intelligence agencies had been monitoring reports of unusual activity in the region since the 1950s, documenting encounters that followed patterns too consistent to dismiss as folklore or misidentification. Witnesses described beings of enormous size and obvious intelligence, living in organized communities that operated according to social structures that predated human civilization. The planning for the raid involved multiple agencies and months of preparation as officials struggled to develop protocols for a situation that had no precedent in law enforcement history. Psychological profiles of Thomas suggested a man who had undergone fundamental changes that went beyond normal human adaptation to wilderness living. Someone who might have developed loyalties that transcended national boundaries or even species identification. The final decision to proceed with the raid came from the highest levels of government, driven by concerns that Thomas's situation represented a potential security threat that could no longer be ignored. The creature's preparations for potential human contact revealed a level of strategic thinking that challenged everything Thomas thought he knew about their intelligence. They had been observing human society for generations, learning about military tactics, government operations, and technological capabilities through captured individuals like himself. Their hidden communities throughout the mountains were connected by communication networks that used natural acoustics to coordinate responses to any threat, with Thomas serving as both an intelligence asset and a potential bargaining chip. Thomas's role in the creature's society evolved from captive to reluctant collaborator as they began to rely on his knowledge of human psychology and behavior. They would consult him before making decisions that might affect their interactions with the outside world, treating him as an advisor while never allowing him to forget that his life depended entirely on their continued tolerance. This position gave him access to information about their long-term plans, including contingency strategies for dealing with government investigation and potential relocation to even more remote territories. The breakthrough that would eventually lead to Thomas's escape came when the creatures began experiencing internal conflicts over how to handle the increasing human presence in their territory. Younger members of their community advocated for more aggressive responses to government surveillance, while older individuals preferred the traditional approach of remaining hidden and avoiding contact. These disagreements created opportunities for Thomas to exploit as he began to understand the political dynamics that governed their society and the ways he might use their divisions to his advantage. The creature's decision to relocate deeper into the wilderness provided Thomas with the opportunity he had been waiting for decades to exploit. During the chaos of moving their entire community through underground tunnel systems, Thomas managed to slip away from his guards and begin the desperate journey back to human civilization. The escape took weeks, with Thomas navigating through terrain that had been deliberately altered to confuse and disorient anyone attempting to leave their territory without permission. He survived on roots and berries, avoiding the main trails where he knew the creatures would be searching for him, following streams and ridgelines that he hoped would eventually lead him back to the world he had been stolen from 40 years earlier. The physical toll of his escape nearly killed Thomas before he reached civilization, his body weakened by decades of captivity and the stress of his desperate flight through the wilderness. He had lost nearly 50 pounds by the time he stumbled out of the forest, his clothes hanging in tatters and his mind barely able to process the reality that he was finally free. The first humans he encountered, hikers on a popular trail, were so frightened by his appearance that they initially fled, thinking he was some kind of wild man or dangerous vagrant. It took hours of patient explanation before they agreed to help him reach the authorities, and even then they seemed skeptical of his claims about what had happened to him in the mountains. Thomas's arrival at the FBI field office in Seattle marked the end of a nightmare that had consumed 40 years of his life, but also the beginning of a new kind of captivity as government agents struggled to process his incredible story. The physical evidence he provided, photographs, artifacts, and detailed maps of the creature's territory, corroborated his account in ways that forced investigators to confront the possibility that something unprecedented was living in the mountains of the Pacific Northwest. His detailed knowledge of government surveillance techniques and military tactics, information he could only have obtained through his forced cooperation with the creatures, convinced even the most skeptical agents that his story contained elements of truth that couldn't be dismissed. The morning of the raid, federal agents approached Thomas's abandoned cabin, expecting to find evidence that would either confirm or debunk his incredible claims. Instead, they discovered a property that challenged their understanding of what was possible for a single human being to accomplish under duress. The main cabin had been expanded over the years into a complex of interconnected structures, built with architectural techniques that seemed to blend human engineering with construction methods that appeared in no textbook. The buildings showed evidence of occupancy by beings of vastly different sizes, with doorways and furniture scaled for both human proportions and creatures that would have to stand nearly 9 feet tall. Inside the cabin, investigators found living spaces that told the story of captivity rather than voluntary cohabitation. Multiple sleeping areas had been constructed, some sized for human occupants and others clearly designed for much larger beings. The kitchen contained cooking implements and storage systems that could accommodate the dietary needs of Thomas's captors, with evidence of food preparation techniques that combined human methods with practices that seemed to originate from an entirely different culinary tradition. Most intriguing were the books and documents found throughout the property. Journals written in Thomas's handwriting, but containing symbols and languages that no linguist could identify, alongside what appeared to be maps of underground tunnel systems that extended for miles beneath the surrounding mountains. The search of Thomas's property revealed evidence of technological capabilities that the creatures had forced him to develop in their remote location. Solar panels and wind generators provided power for a sophisticated communication system that included radio equipment capable of reaching frequencies that weren't supposed to be accessible to civilian operators. Computer equipment, primitive by modern standards but advanced for its time, contained files that documented decades of observations about wildlife behavior, weather patterns, and geological activity in the region. But the most compelling discovery was a collection of photographs that showed Thomas in the company of beings that science insisted didn't exist. Massive, hair-covered humanoids that displayed obvious intelligence and what appeared to be complete dominance over their human captive. The photographic evidence found in Thomas's cabin documented a relationship that had evolved over decades, from initial capture to reluctant cooperation under duress. Early images showed Thomas as a younger man, clearly terrified and uncertain, standing at a considerable distance from massive figures that loomed threateningly in the shadows. Later photographs revealed growing submission and compliance, with Thomas eventually appearing in staged portraits alongside beings of various sizes, including what appeared to be juveniles and elderly individuals. The final photographs in the collection showed Thomas participating in ceremonies and activities that seemed to blend human and non-human traditions, suggesting that he had been forced to integrate into a society that operated according to rules unknown to the outside world. The basement of Thomas's cabin contained discoveries that would be classified by government agencies and never released to the public. Archaeological artifacts suggested that the area had been continuously inhabited for thousands of years, with evidence of a civilization that had developed along entirely different lines from human society. tools and weapons showed craftsmanship that exceeded anything produced by known indigenous cultures, made from materials that didn't match the local geology and using techniques that seemed to require both enormous strength and incredible precision. Most disturbing were the human artifacts mixed among these alien objects, personal items that belonged to missing persons from across the Pacific Northwest, suggesting that Thomas's captors had been collecting humans from the outside world for generations. The investigation team's attempts to track the creatures' whereabouts led them deeper into the mountains, following trails that seemed to have been deliberately obscured but still showed signs of recent use by multiple large beings. The footprints they discovered matched those found around missing person cases dating back decades, but the pattern suggested organized hunting rather than random encounters. GPS equipment malfunctioned in certain areas, compasses spun wildly, and radio communication became impossible, as if the forest itself was actively interfering with their technology. Several team members reported feeling watched throughout their search, and motion-activated cameras they left behind captured images of massive shapes moving through the trees with an intelligence and purpose that challenged everything they thought they knew about wildlife behavior. The deeper the investigation team ventured into the wilderness, the more they encountered evidence of a sophisticated infrastructure that had been hidden beneath the forest canopy for generations. Ancient trails connected clearings that showed signs of regular use by large communities, with evidence of sustainable resource management that had maintained the forest's health while supporting a significant population of predators. Underground water systems had been engineered to provide clean drinking water throughout the territory, using techniques that seemed to work in harmony with natural hydrology rather than disrupting it. Most remarkably, the team discovered what appeared to be a communication network that used natural acoustics to carry messages across vast distances, with strategically placed rock formations that could amplify and direct sound waves through the mountains. The search for the creatures extended over several weeks, covering hundreds of square miles of wilderness that seemed to shift and change in ways that defied topographic maps. Helicopter overflights revealed structures hidden beneath the forest canopy, buildings that appeared to be constructed from living trees, shaped and guided rather than cut and assembled. These structures formed a network throughout the mountains, connected by paths that were invisible from ground level but clearly visible from above, suggesting a transportation system that had been developed over generations. The pilots reported equipment malfunctions when flying over certain areas, with instruments failing and engines running rough, as if something was actively discouraging aerial observation. The few witnesses who came forward during the investigation told stories that painted a picture of Thomas as a victim rather than a willing participant in whatever was happening in the mountains. Local indigenous elders spoke of him as someone who had been chosen against his will to serve as a bridge between worlds, forced to facilitate communication between human civilization and something that preferred to remain hidden while preying upon it. They described encounters with Thomas over the years, where he had appeared increasingly desperate and broken, serving as an unwilling translator and mediator in conflicts between their communities and the forest dwellers who had been there long before European settlement. The investigation took a dramatic turn when team members began experiencing encounters that challenged their understanding of what was possible in the modern world. Equipment would be moved overnight, arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence and perhaps even mockery, as if unseen observers were demonstrating their superiority over the human searchers. Food supplies would disappear, only to be replaced with wild edibles that had been prepared and arranged with obvious care and skill, but also with an undertone of threat that suggested the creatures could provide or withhold sustenance at will. Most unsettling were the sounds that echoed through the forest at night, vocalizations that resembled human speech, but in frequencies and patterns that suggested vocal cords far larger than any person possessed, carrying on conversations in languages that predated known human communication. The psychological effects on the investigation team became increasingly pronounced as their search continued, with several members reporting dreams and visions that seemed more real than waking life. These experiences always featured the same elements: vast underground cities carved from living rock, technologies that operated on principles beyond human understanding, and beings of enormous size and obvious intelligence who watched the searchers with expressions that conveyed both curiosity and predatory intent. Some team members began to question their mission, wondering whether they were investigating a threat to national security or walking into a trap that had been set by something far more intelligent than they had anticipated. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators discovered Thomas's personal journals, hidden in a cache that had been sealed with techniques that required both human intelligence and non-human strength to access. The journals documented 40 years of captivity with beings that Thomas referred to as the Old Ones, creatures that had inhabited the Pacific Northwest for millennia before human arrival. His entries described a gradual process of psychological breaking and forced adaptation, beginning with terrifying encounters and evolving into reluctant cooperation born of desperation and the will to survive. The journals revealed that Thomas had been chosen not randomly, but because of specific qualities that made him suitable for serving as an unwilling liaison between species that had been capturing humans from civilization for centuries. Thomas's writings described a society that operated according to principles that challenged human assumptions about intelligence, technology, and social organization. The beings he lived with had developed sustainable technologies that worked in harmony with natural systems, creating communities that could exist for generations without depleting their environment. But they used this knowledge to maintain their dominance over captured humans. They possessed knowledge of medicine, agriculture, and engineering that far exceeded human capabilities in some areas, while remaining deliberately primitive in others. Most remarkably, they had maintained detailed records of human development over centuries, watching and occasionally intervening in ways that had influenced the course of history without ever revealing their presence. The final entries in Thomas's journals, written during his desperate escape through the wilderness, revealed the true horror of his 4 decades in captivity and his growing realization that he might be the only human who had ever successfully escaped their control. He wrote about the impossible choice between remaining a captive and risking everything in an attempt to reach civilization, describing the terror of knowing that recapture would result in punishment worse than death. His final words spoke of a responsibility to warn humanity about the predators that lived in the shadows of civilization, beings that viewed humans as nothing more than specimens to be collected, studied, and ultimately consumed. The area around Thomas's former prison was quietly designated as a protected wilderness zone, with access restricted under environmental protection laws that were actually designed to prevent further contact with whatever lived in those mountains. Satellite monitoring of the region continues to this day, showing activity patterns that suggest the creatures are still there, still hunting, still collecting humans who venture too deep into their domain. Thomas remains in protective custody, his testimony classified at the highest levels of government, but his warnings about the predators that live in the wilderness have become part of the folklore whispered among those who understand that some secrets are too dangerous for civilization to acknowledge. The legacy of Thomas Garrett serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers that lurk in the spaces between the known and unknown, a reminder that humanity's dominance over the natural world may be nothing more than an illusion maintained by creatures intelligent enough to remain hidden while they hunt. His 40 years of captivity revealed the existence of a predatory intelligence that has been operating in the shadows of human civilization for generations, collecting specimens and studying their prey with the patience of beings who measure time in centuries rather than years. The mountains remain quiet now, but those who know the truth understand that the silence is not empty. It's waiting for the next human to venture too deep into territories where ancient predators still claim dominion over all who enter their realm.